6 colors on this shirt. All right, well, thanks guys for coming out. I do have a lot of videos online, stuff like that. I try to make these, like I was saying, as open as possible because you guys are here, you paid, you want to ask questions to get better. So once again, please feel free to ask questions. Just great topics of conversation. They open up different things we can talk about. So the first thing we are going to talk about is grip. Grip is one of those things that we're all different shapes and sizes here, so we're not going to have the exact same grip. There are some similarities in top pros that world champions, US champions have used these things in their grip to help make them who they are. So there's a couple things you do want to have in your game. There's a couple things you want to stay away from. The way that I grip the disc is called a power grip. A majority of pros, whenever they're throwing a drive over 200 or 250 feet, use a power grip. The thing with the power grip here, you can see my fingers are basically slanted backwards. You want to avoid gripping the disc with a straight grip like that. You're gonna kind of force to put your thumb towards the middle whenever you do that. You want to kind of slant your fingers back this way. Another thing that you want to avoid is that pointer finger. You kind of always want to lay it on the outside of the rim here. You don't ever really want to tuck it like this because it becomes more of a hook, and it's really hard to get your finger out from underneath the disc whenever you tuck that underneath. So if you're trying out the power grip, it is the pads of the finger on the inside of the disc here. Another type of grip that some top pros use is a stacked grip, to where they're stacking their fingers on the back of the disc here. Once again, the fingers are slanted. You're not going to find a whole lot of players who throw power drives to where their fingers are straight underneath the rim like this. A lot of the grips are to where their fingers towards the back of their hand this way. With another grip that I use, so this is the power grip. The other grip for shorter shots is called a fan grip, and it's exactly like it sounds. It's very similar to like a putting grip, but the whole point of a fan grip is for the disc to come out of your hand much easier. So for shorter shots, it's all about spinning the disc with the pads of your finger and kind of looking at the target the whole time. It's really easy to manipulate the angle of release that you have on the fan grip, and it's also just all about opening up your hand. With the power grip, on release, it's kind of a combination of the disc ripping out of your hand, and then it's a combination of kind of letting go too as well. So you're not ever going to feel like you're throwing a really hard drive and opening up your hand towards the target. When you're ripping through, there's a little tiny bit of release, but a majority of it is the disc ripping out of your hand. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more. But with fan grip, the reason why it's really accurate for shorter type shots is because you can open up your hand, you can add a little bit of spin or change the angle of release, and it's really easy just to land it next to the basket. That's the whole point of the fan grip. So if you guys have problems with shorter approach shots, or if you have problems with approach shots, you always hit the one tree that you got to miss, like we always do, try out the fan grip, see if it helps. It's really easy to add into your game. And the best way to kind of practice the fan grip is throwing back and forth with somebody in the field. But with the fan grip, it's the two fingers here squeezing the middle of the flight plate with the thumb. And you can kind of spin it in your hand by doing that right there. That's where the pressure comes from. It's really easy to squeeze, and then you can kind of test your grip. You don't really need the pointer finger or the pinky too much because there's really not a lot of pressure on these two. The pointer finger and the pinky are really kind of controlling the front edge of the disc and then the back edge of the disc. So you can kind of control the angle of those two fingers. So one more time, you can kind of see how I'm pinching it right there. There's some pros, and a majority of top pros use a fan grip for shorter type shots. Some pros will actually line up their thumb and their two fingers here. So you can squeeze that flight plate. I don't have any see-through disc, but my thumb and my fingers will be on the same place. But I actually angle my fingers backward and then use the pressure of the thumb on top to kind of squeeze right there. Another thing with the fan grip too, you can kind of squeeze with the pointer finger just a little tiny bit to kind of give you that pressure on the front side of the disc to help control the angle of release. But one more time with the fan grip, it really is all about spinning the disc out of your hand, not throwing very hard, just nice and easy to ground. Does anybody have any questions with that grip that we were just talking about? So kind of going on with grip, the next thing, since we were talking about the fingers underneath the disc, the next thing, and probably the most important, is the thumb position on top. The thumb position is what's actually going to engage your forearm muscles and your back muscles and where you're going to get more distance if you have a stronger grip. A couple different ways to have your thumb on top of the disc. I have it basically like I'm giving somebody my thumbprint on top right there. So I'm squeezing down. Like this disc is a little bit softer, so you can kind of see like I'm squeezing down on top like that right there. Avery Jenkins is a world champion. He actually puts his thumb more like this. He has that pressure on top there. Nicola Castro, 3-time player of the year, he lays his thumb across the disc there. They have different grips underneath the rim, so it's kind of how you put your fingers or your grip underneath and how your thumb position is going to come out on top. A thing too with the thumb position, you can kind of see how the disc is situated in my hand in relation to my forearm. There's a lot of videos online that talk about you must line up your forearm here to kind of get it situated in your hand. For me, you can actually see a little bit of a line because I gripped it really tight right there. It goes across my pointer finger, almost halfway, maybe like a third above from the top, and it kind of goes towards the fat of my hand on the bottom left. So for me, it's just all about being really tight when I'm throwing a distant shot. I want a nice, tight grip that I feel like I have a really strong fist whenever I'm gripping it. And then for fan grip, one more time, it's actually gripped a little bit higher up, but just nice and tight. The thing with grip is we're all going to be different shapes and sizes. We all have different hand pressures, muscles in our hands, so we're not always going to grip the disc the same. Scott Stokely, who was the first person to ever throw over, I think, 700 feet back in the day, he's 6'10", and he would grip the disc like this, right here. Put his fingers out towards the middle of the rim. He had massive hands. Looked like he could palm 2 basketballs at the same time. But he would just put his fingers out here because he most likely couldn't do the power grip this way. So if you guys don't feel like you can put your fingers underneath the rim, there's so many different ways that you can have a nice tight grip but still throw pretty far. Does that make sense for grip? Any questions on that? All right, so the next thing that on grip is we're going to move to the wrist position. The wrist position is something that's going to give you more distance, and it's also going to give you the accuracy. So when you see a lot of the top pros, they have a ton of distance and it looks effortless. That means that the disc coming out of their hand is super clean. It's extremely aerodynamic. It's not going to have many wobbles. And the wrist position, using it the right way, is going to give you the most amount of spin without having that off-axis rotation. So the wrist needs to function in is basically like hinging like a door. So if everybody grips their disc, hold it out in front of them here, you want to make sure that your wrist is moving in this position. And if you kind of move your wrist differently, it doesn't feel like you're near as efficient, near as strong, but if you kind of come in towards the forearm here and out, that's basically how each shot should feel like when you're coming through. Now when you shake it or when you roll it over, when you see the disc fly out of their hand like with a bunch of wobbles, that means that your wrist was coming back. And when you go to throw, you roll your wrist over, what a lot of people call off-axis rotation. But you want to make sure you basically lock that thumb in, and it works more like a door hinge than it does rolling anything over. Does that make sense? So the wrist is actually going to be what moves into our next part, which is going, yeah?
Do you lock your wrist at all when you're taking your shot?
That's a really good question. So with wrist, the biggest thing that is like the biggest no with the wrist is when you're going to reach back, you want to make sure you're avoiding having an outward wrist like that. That's the one thing you want to avoid. You want to make sure that your wrist or the disc, you can say whatever it is, the wrist is almost perfectly flat with the forearm.
Okay.
Because what we're going to talk about too here in a second, but this does go with wrist. Whenever you're leading with the elbow and staying on one straight line, the wrist is actually going to become loaded at about your front leg right here.
Okay.
So almost every single person could stand there in a little bit wider than shoulder length, and then when they're pulling through in one straight line, their wrist becomes loaded about their front foot. And to keep it on one straight line, this is actually where the release happens, and then your wrist opens up to stay on that one line.
Okay, so you don't preload your wrist.
Nope. I don't necessarily think it hurts, but I just think, and I know that your wrist is going to become loaded about halfway through your throw right here. As long as it's on the inside of your body, or like I was talking about, as long as your wrist isn't open that way.
Okay.
That's the one thing that will hurt a lot, is if your wrist is open there.
Does that imply a looser grip as you're coming through? If it's going to load itself, you're not holding it
So
too
with
firm?
the pressure, so kind of, is that what you're talking about, like how tight you grip the disc?
Yeah.
So with how tight I grip the disc, it's almost like a handshake. So a handshake of how tight you're going to grip somebody's hands. It's not necessarily like a death grip, and it's not going to be soft. You want to make sure it's nice and tight, fairly confident. Yeah, you don't want it falling out of your hand by any means. And another thing too that kind of goes along with that, and I don't know if this was your question or not, but you want to make sure you're not locking your wrist. So a lot of people I see lock their wrist, and when they're pulling through, like you can see I'm not moving my wrist at all, and that yeah, it doesn't create any type of spin on it at all. It's like a much more of a knuckleball pulling through this way. But when you pull through this way, you're kind of not also leading on that, leading with the elbow also. But that will kind of be the next thing that we're talking about. Any questions with that? So the next thing that we're talking about, when we talk about stance and everything, I try to work from the ground up. So if you guys want to kind of do a couple motions with me, feel free to stand up and kind of go through a couple things. But for stance and using your lower body, which is the most important thing whenever you're trying to pick up distance, and it's one of the biggest problems I see that people have, is how their upper body is located in relation to their lower body. So with upper body, and what I like to do whenever doing clinics is I talk about throwing standing still, because throwing standing still is basically this last half step. So if I was going to throw a shot to this basket, this is the motion that you ultimately want to work on 90% of your time. The reason why I really think that, there's back in 2006, do you guys know who Paul Ulibarri is? He's a touring pro, travels around for the last 10 or 15 years. He was the first person I saw throw over 500 feet in Phoenix, Arizona at the Memorial. And when he threw over 500 feet, he had no type of X-step, and he would actually hold his disc, swing his leg up, and then load up on his back leg, and then would throw like that. So with loading up on that back leg here, he ultimately is getting in the same position as every other top disc golfer in the world. He's just not using that X-step coming through. He has since changed his form a little bit, but that last half a step is really the most important thing. So when we're talking about stance here and talking about getting better in training or practice routines, what I like to do is go out to a field, practice in this stance right here, almost shoulder width. You want to make sure that your feet are square, and this front foot is going to be a little bit more turned back. The feet are going to be the controller of loading your hips, and kind of going back to one of the bigger problems that I see. One of the things, helping scans and on his form is I see a lot of people coming through, and on that last step, they see their front foot being open here. And with your front foot on your last step, you actually want to be almost completely backwards on your toe. And if you guys stand there and open up your foot and then try to reach back, you'll be able to feel kind of the resistance that your hips are going to give you. And that's something that you want to avoid. And now everybody turn their foot this way and then try to reach back, and you can feel that you're almost getting another 6 inches of flexibility just by moving that foot backwards. So something to really try out whenever you guys throw a bunch of shots after we're done here is on that last step, make sure to really turn that foot back. And then the next thing that we're going to talk about is how your upper body is located. So upper body, a little drill that I have is basically loading up on this back foot. And you guys can actually do this at your house to really work on loading the back leg. Because loading the back leg in relation to other sports is exactly how you get all the momentum or all the power into your shot. Baseball and golf are kind of the two examples I like to use. And you see a lot of baseball players, whenever they're going to hit a home run, they're loading up on this back leg, they're picking up the front foot and then exploding off of that leg. And we're mimicking that same thing, except mirrored, loading on this back leg and accelerating through with the hips and the lower body first. So the problem that I see a lot of people have, and the reason why they're not using their lower body, is because when they go to take that last step, their upper body continues and goes with this last step, and they plant and they brace on this foot. So a little drill that I, kind of came up with for people to kind of get away from that habit is to put all your weight on your back foot, whatever that is, and then have the front foot go forward like it's just kind of a balance tool, and then bend your knee at the same time. So it would basically look like this. So you would pretend like you're lining up for a shot, and then you would load on that back leg there. Because when you're loading up on this back leg, you're actually going to be accelerating with your hips first, and then pulling through at the same time. The problem that people have is when they load up here, and then they move forward like this, and they're bracing whenever they're landing on the tee pad with that last step. So you want to make sure that that upper body is not following the last step and really bracing right there. You want to make sure that it's loading on that back leg, and then at the last second, it's pulling through, and the hips go first, and the disc is right behind them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I just talked a lot, so somebody's got a question. Does anybody have a question?
Pretty good at explaining it.
Well, thanks. I think that's good. So I'll throw an example for you guys. There really is, like, I'll walk around the grocery store and I'll do that little drill because I know that I either have a tournament coming up or we all can't just go to the field every single day. But you really want to work on loading something, you know, and loading is a term I always like to use whenever you're working on basically building energy from behind you and accelerating and getting as much power coming through. So like we were talking about loading your wrist, loading your hip is probably the most important thing. So loading your hip is going to be this front foot there, and then making sure you're loaded on this back foot. So throw a shot here. So I'm just loading on this back foot. I'm gonna go nice and slow. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
That's awesome.
So the next thing that we'll talk about is accuracy. And you know, of course, we all want to be more accurate. We can all be more accurate, including myself. It doesn't matter about distance or anything like that. The main thing with accuracy is 3 lines. I call it 3 lines of play. So the 3 lines of play that I'm looking for whenever lining up for a shot is I'm lining up my feet position, and my feet position go into the run up or my last step or anything like that, so you can think of it that way. So that's one line. The next line is my shoulders, making sure my shoulders are not squared towards the target here, making sure that they're basically lined up across my dominant shoulder. I'm looking through the right way. And the next line is going to be my reach back. So making sure my reach back is matching all of those 3 lines. So all of those lines are going to be the exact same. So if I'm lining up towards the basket, dead straight shot, I'm looking to basically line up, put the line down this way, line up with my shoulder here, and then if I'm looking to release there, I'm looking to keep the disc on that same line reaching back, and then same line whenever I pull through. So if I can do that, you know, of course, it's going to be a great shot. We're not always going to hit the perfect shot, but to keep it on that straight line when you're reaching back, you want to make sure that you're rotating your whole upper body. So another thing of reaching back, so if everybody just stood there, don't move your upper body at all and kind of put the disc behind you, you'll feel like basically a resistance on your arm, like you can only go so far. But if you hold the disc in front of you and then you just rotate your left shoulder, think of just rotating your left shoulder, you can actually get to that same position without moving any further. So with reach back, you want to make sure that that left shoulder is almost mirroring that right shoulder whenever it starts to reach back. And so the next thing that goes with that is your hand. And so a lot of people have a problem going here, or they hold on to the disc, or something along those lines, because this left hand gets in the way if you don't move it. And so an analogy that I like to use is just like an ice skater whenever they're trying to spin around really fast. We're kind of doing a really quick version of that. We're trying to move as fast as possible, so you want all your limbs close to your body. So what I do is I basically keep my left hand on my disc, and as soon as I start to go reach back, I tuck this left hand as tight as I can, and then reach back almost with this elbow and the shoulder to where I can get full extension all the way back. So whenever you guys go and reach back and you're looking for more distance, that is something really easy, because you can go from, you know, almost no reach back to like another 2 or 3 feet almost, because you can just rotate your upper body. But a couple problems that people have whenever they try to rotate their upper body is they try to pull in too much this way, or they go away, or they come up. And so the next thing that we'll talk about is reach back and where the disc should be whenever you're reaching back. Anybody have any questions with the rotating upper body? No questions ever? All All right, somebody's gonna get there. All right. So reach back position, to get like super scientific, reach back and where your disc is located is basically the point where you're gonna start accelerating. So wherever your reach back is, you wanna make sure that you're at a really good acceleration point. Because what's gonna happen as soon as you reach that point here, you wanna make sure that one straight line is going to be no hiccups, no swoops, no different angles mixed in there. So you want to make sure that your reach back is almost closer to your hip in comparison to your shoulder. And so that kind of comes into body position. And just like I kind of touched on golf and baseball, body position is really important because when you're standing straight up and down and going to throw, let's say, a harder shot, it's really easy to have your arm at almost any position here. But you want to make sure that you're always bending your knees, you're always on your toes, and when you bend your knees and you lean over just a little bit, just like in golf and baseball, you never really see golfers just standing straight up and down and trying to hit the ball this way. You're always nose over toes. So when you're nose over toes, your weight almost kind of sticks out onto your toes as well. So you kind of have a lot more balance that way. And then when you reach back, you're almost, taking away the fact that your disc cannot be too high. If you're too high, obviously you're coming straight across your face, and that's the last thing that you want to do. Your disc should actually be much closer to your hip. And then when you accelerate, you want to be at a little bit of a lower position, and then accelerate through your core, and then almost have a slight higher release. And so that almost sounds like counterproductive to some people because they always want to keep their disc low. But what happens is when they keep their disc up high, thinking that they're going to accelerate and hopefully keep their disc low, is anything that happens on the back side of your body whenever you're reaching back will get mirrored whenever you're pulling through. So if I reach back and my disc is up high here and I start to accelerate and pull through, there's really only two things that can happen. And one of those things is to either pull straight across this way. If you pull straight across your chest or really high on your body, you're not really going to use any muscle or any forearm or any back muscle, so you're going to be missing out on a lot of distance. The other thing is where you're going to pull down and you can go straight into the ground, which is never fun to do. You're only going to go about a few feet off the tee. And then the last thing would be pulling down and then swooping back up. And then what happens when you swoop back up or that nose comes up right here, the wind's going to hit the bottom of the disc and it's going to lose like 60 to 70% of all the power and then go probably straight left with your right hand. So we all had the problem of getting the highest, fastest speed disc that we could get whenever we went to the store to get our first disc. And so one of the bigger problems is, you come out here and you don't have the correct form or you don't know how to throw, and then the disc shoots way left and then you learn to throw sidearm or you learn to throw tomahawk or you learn to turn it over really hard. But you want to make sure that you have the right disc selection. So if you're sitting there thinking like all of my discs are going to go straight left if I do what he's telling me to do, then maybe the discs are a little bit too overstable, and you should try something that's either like a putter or a lighter driver or a lighter fairway driver or something along those lines, because you want to make sure that you're in the right body position, and you're not always standing straight up and down. It's really easy to turn it over all the time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What do you do if it's a drive that's going to be mostly downhill or one's going to be mostly uphill? What do you make the adjustments to kind of add to the contour?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And so what I try to do with downhill and uphill, depending on the ceiling, if you're going low ceiling or something along those lines, it is all about release. So like you were saying, if you're going straight down here, and there's a hole in Nashville, one of my home courses, that is almost straight downhill and is low ceiling as well. So if you have any amount of height on your disc, you're going to hit the cedar trees and you're going to drop like 100 feet off the tee. So at that point, you do want to have almost a slightly higher reach back because you're going to come down and you have to make sure that that nose angle is straight down towards the ground. And so there's a couple shots, and out here you guys have a lot of elevation in relation to some of the other Massachusetts courses I've seen, and you almost have to do that sometimes. I think it was hole 6 or 7, the short one down the hill. That's actually a really good example, because if you have a normal release, you're going to be way too high and fade away left. So you have to make sure you're getting that nose angle and making sure that it's almost nice and flat and down because the wind's going to get underneath it so easy going downhill and it'll just shoot way left. But for going uphill, it's also about release. So with your reach back, you're almost coming down and then coming straight up. And those two things on disc selection, when you're going uphill or downhill, you want to make sure, the way that I think of it and the best way for me to teach it is to think of, dead center flat as, gravity. And when you're going or throwing up high, if I was just going to throw a disc straight up into the air here, it's going to slow down and go way left. So if you're throwing uphill, you need something that's less overstable to get the most amount of distance, because you're going uphill and you're fighting gravity the whole time, and your disc wants to slow down faster than if we were just going to throw in this field. So same thing goes when you're throwing downhill. Downhill, I usually try to go more overstable. On that specific shot, it's a little bit different because it's so short, so you don't want to throw that much of an overstable disc. But for a longer, more downhill shot, I usually go more overstable because it speeds up so fast, and you have to keep the nose angle down so much. So something understable is just going to speed up, go too fast, and turn over. Does anybody have any questions with that kind of stuff? Any questions on that? Okay, so the next thing.
Oh, actually, I got one.
Yeah.
So what I do for uphill shots, I try and like disc down a little bit.
Yep.
That'd be like an alternative to the
Going uphill?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, because when you disc down, it's also, could be like a less overstable disc, or keeping it nice and straight, because when you go uphill, your disc becomes so much more overstable. So going fairway driver or even mid-range or something like that, they slow down so much faster that it might be better to just keep it into the middle.
Okay.
Yeah, or less overstable too as well.
Yeah, because I find that if I do less stable, it'll just like go right out into like usually the shit.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So on the follow through, like after the shot, like you're kind of doing that like the high and low shot downhill.
Yep.
And you're saying the back bearing the front. Does that mean like your follow through want to come through low and down?
So you're talking about like a downhill shot?
Yeah, or the uphill same
Yes.
thing.
So that's a good question. And so with follow through is best described for me. The best way to teach it is relatable to if you were going to put a hula hoop around your body. And if you think of that axis of the hula hoop, so if we all were just going to stand there, we had a hula hoop around me and it's just perfectly flat. That's obviously, if I'm going to reach back and follow that axis of the hula hoop, my hand is going to come through and really stay on that same axis. You want to make sure that it's staying on that. So if you're going to have a really low reach back, if you're leaning back, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you're leaning back and almost throwing lower because you have to come down, then your hand is going to continue on that axis coming down. And that's kind of the next thing that we'll talk about. So the next thing that we will talk about is, I'm going to make a 10 pad here. When we were talking about lining up for your shot, talking about that 3 lines. So the feet actually do go back into your run-up. So if I'm trying to throw it, release it dead straight, I'm looking to line up there, and that actually goes straight back into my run-up towards the target. So my feet, after my first step, are almost exactly on, or trying to be, on that one straight line of release. So when I change that, if I'm trying to throw a big left to right shot into the basket, it's all about moving this back foot. So if this is straight and I move the back foot this way, my feet rotate and my shoulders rotate. I'm not ever going to be square to the target here. So that line, once again, is going to continue into my run-up, so I'm actually going to be running up from this back right side of the tee pad. And just like we were talking about with follow-through and body position go hand in hand. When I'm throwing an Anheuser, once again, I'm running up on that straight line. I'm not running down the middle here and then thinking I'm gonna go Anheuser at the last second. I always wanna stay on that one line, try to keep as much momentum as I can going almost towards the front left of the tee pad. And then body position with follow-through together is what's going to make that big turnover shot. So like we were talking about, if you lean over just a little bit here, it's really hard to have your arm up. The last thing that you actually want to do, and kind of an obvious question, everybody here watch disc golf on YouTube?
Yeah.
You know, raise your hand if you watch disc golf on YouTube, almost every single person. So something to really pay attention on those videos is is how the pros attack tee shots. Not necessarily disc selection, but how they come across the tee pad and how relatable it is to other shots at your home course, because you'll see Eagle come up and he'll throw a really big left to right tee shot, but he won't even be in the camera until he hits the last second of the tee pad here, because he's looking to have a release angle that looks like this to where he can have that big left to right shot. Same thing goes for if they're throwing a big right to left shot. Their back foot is going to be here, and if they're throwing into this tree, trying to come to the basket, their run up is going to be all the way back this way. So with body position, how that goes into that is that with that left to right shot, their elbows are almost always going to be in the same angle in relation to their shoulder. You never see a pro stand there and throw their arm up this way and then come across their head here, unless it's like a crazy roller and they're coming this way. But once again, they're leaning so far back and then pulling over. And so one thing that I've been teaching a lot lately is that I believe all pros have a 45-degree angle on their elbow in relation to their shoulder. So if everybody holds their arms straight out here, and kind of go make a little 90-degree angle on your elbow, and then move your arm, from perfectly flat halfway down. What pros do is instead of moving their arm up and down, they're actually just moving their body position to throw whatever angle they want to have. And so that exactly relates to the wrist position. So the reason why it relates to the wrist position is they're not going to tilt the wrist trying to throw dead straight. They're going to move their body position. So if they're trying to throw that Anheuser shot, they're going to lean back, and just like we talked about at the very beginning, they're going to hinge the wrist and put spin on the disc by coming across and doing this. They're not going to stand here and then tilt their wrist up and then expect to throw some type of turnover by throwing at the same body position. Does that make sense? So kind of going into the follow through, the wrist kind of dictates which way you're going to follow through. And so I use that hula hoop analogy as much as I can, because when you're coming through on a turnover, one of the biggest problems is people throw it up into the air like that, and it doesn't really turn over, and then the nose gets up, and then it'll kind of fade to the ground. But the difference between a shot like that and being able to actually bring your hand almost down, like we were talking about, you're following that axis, is you're getting the right side of the disc over enough that the wind is on top of it, and it's not going to stall out and then come straight to the ground. So if this is a putter, it's really easy, much easier to turn over, but a really good example would be like an overstable disc. So this is a D1, one of the more overstable drivers in my bag. I can actually roll it because I can have a really hard finish and a really hard follow through and angle of release. So I'm basically going to release it at about 12 o'clock, and my hand's going to come straight back and all the way down. So I'll do that one more time, and then watch, my hand is going to come straight across, basically. So the same thing kind of goes the opposite way whenever throwing. You see a lot of people throw really understable discs on a slide hyzer, get it to flip up and then fly right, which is one of the more common ways to be either really accurate, or you see a lot of players just put a lot of spin on their disc with that type of shot, go like 200 or 300 feet, flip up, and then go to the right. That's obviously called a hyzer flip shot. The way to do that, one more time, is to really hit that follow through, because a lot of players either won't trust the disc that they're throwing, or they feel like they don't have enough power. So they try to get to this position, and then if you follow through too flat, it's really easy to get the disc to come up and then pull over way too early. This is a really beat up F5. I'm going to try to release it with a slide hyzer. I'm going to keep my hand up at the very end, and I expect it to go towards the tree and then kind of flip up and then fade right at the very end. So one more time, it's very important just to pay attention to that follow through, coming up, making sure that I'm putting spin on the disc and not making it turn over. that's one of the more common shots that you see across the Pro Tour with the slide hyzer, flip up, fly straight, and that's where I see a lot of people also kind of make mistakes on their disc selection because they're either throwing something that's too overstable for their arm speed, or they're getting something that fade lefts and then goes off the fairway every single time, or something they're forced to turn over and throw the S shot. But the best way to throw nice and straight down the tunnel is a nice slight hyzer, flip up, and then fly straight. Anybody have any questions? None? All right. So the next thing we'll talk about is sidearm. So with sidearm, we'll start talking about it the same way as we did backhand. For me, I grip it with basically what's called a stacked grip. A lot of people either use this type of stacked grip. I've seen kind of the old, I think it's a little bit more old school. I know Nate Sexton uses this grip. I think Avery Jenkins uses this grip. Another type of grip I see is, this is I think more of the old school Frisbee style grip. But for me, this is the most efficient type of grip because I can get the pad of my finger on the inside of the rim here. And if you actually push on the front of the disc by your finger, you'll feel it tighten up and you kind of can feel the pad on the inside of the disc. It's really important to be on the inside. You do not want to be on the outside like that. So it's really easy to have the disc really soft in your hand if that's the case. You want to have it almost in that 45-degree angle, the pad of your finger pushing up against it. And also you want to tuck it into kind of the fat of your thumb right here. So a good way to really test the grip is to push right there and making sure that the pad of your finger is on the inside of the rim. Because the last second, when you're getting that spin on the disc, it's coming off the pad of your finger right there. Does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, but when you push on it, that's actually where all of the pressure and the spin and power are going to come from. So making sure that when you can push on the front of the disc here, you can feel the pad of your finger on the inside of the rim.
So why do you jam it all the way into the fat of your thumb? Sometimes I feel like there's some bones and stuff that get in the way on the release, and I end up with a callus right here.
On your pointer finger.
Actually, it's right here on the middle finger.
So let me see your grip.
So I always feel like I go deep.
Yeah, so instead of, it's actually good because you have a see-through disc. Instead of having it that way, put your finger out like this. It sounds really weird, but almost straighter than that. So you actually want it more pads on your finger there. You put your middle finger there. Switch the two there. Yep, but you want it much more on the side angle. What I saw with your grip is you're more here. So you're almost like this trying to grip on this.
Okay.
So you want to make sure your hand is almost at a vertical angle, and then you're adding that grip this way.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yep, totally.
The reason,
Oh, sorry.
No, you got it.
So I use one finger when I'm
Yeah,
cooking.
totally good.
Okay.
Yeah, totally good. I see a lot of people do that. Yeah.
Awesome. What's your thumb like on your forehead?
My
Are you,
thumb,
are you pointing it like forward, or is it pointed toward the middle of the disc?
it's actually more forward. I mean, the way that I feel anyways with grip could be the same way as backhand. That it's a little bit more on top of it. So I feel like there's more time for your disc to get out. But you want to be as tight as you can on the rim of the disc. One of the bigger problems I see when people throwing sidearm is they focus on gripping the center of the disc, kind of like in backhand or anything like that. But I think you need much more pressure on the rim because that's how you're putting the spin and you're pulling through and pushing on the disc, basically. Yeah.
Thumb placement on the top, closer to the rim, even with the backhand. Is that going to create more anhyzer than if you put it towards the center of the disc, more hyzer?
I actually think pushing the thumb towards the side is really easy for it to slide off on backhand.
Yeah.
You don't have enough surface area, I guess, to really press down, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because if you get closer to the rim is the hardest part of the disc because it's the thickest. So if you're pushing your thumb on that rim there, it seems like it's really easy to slide off. So I always suggest at least staying on the outside of the rim as much as you can, because you want to have a softer area on top to where you can kind of squeeze down. And then thumb area for sidearm, I stay, behind my fingers, but it's much more pointed that way. Like you were saying, is, he was asking if it's more towards the center or more towards the side. and I try to keep it more towards the side because it's kind of controlling this side of the disc here. If the thumb is kind of out towards the middle, I feel like this becomes loose in my hand, and that's a reason why I always suggest people to kind of put it into their thumb here, because if it's not in there, it's actually kind of wobbly in your hand. The last thing you want whenever you're going to go throw is it to be any type of all soft in your hand or anything like that. So, yeah.
And then I saw you do 2 fingers. One finger just less stability, or?
No, I think it really depends on which finger is strongest.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just being comfortable, because some people will do this, and it feels like there's too much underneath your hand.
Yeah, I feel like it's too bulky.
And a good way too, like I was showing him, to really test the grip, making sure you use your hand correctly, if that makes sense. But you always want to use your wrist one more time, just like it's hinging. And backhand, it's going this way, sidearm is going this way, so a good way to kind of test your grip is to hold your hand out and then kind of put the disc on top of it there. So that's the most powerful position you can get with your wrist. It's really easy for people to flip it this way because they're used to throwing a baseball or football or something like that, and you want to avoid rolling this wrist over. You want to make sure that it's coming through and putting the spin on your disc there. So when people kind of have, like he was had a little bit of problem with his grip, I suggest putting your hand out there and then kind of put your fingers on it like that and kind of close your hand, and that's the best way to use it, like a hinge, I guess. So, yeah.
And is the flick the same way? It just kind of like self-sets the cock back?
Yes, exactly. So I think too with the sidearm, when you're going to reach back, you're almost always in that loaded position. You want to make sure you're not coming forward, because when you do come forward, you would have to move backward to even pull through, because the loaded wrist position for a sidearm is looking more like this, because when you come through, it's coming out of your hand there.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, so kind of the next thing,
Because sometimes when I pull back, I feel like a half second, and then I feel like that's when I'm cocked, and then
and that's actually really good too with timing and tempo. Backhand goes the same thing. One more time, we all watch videos online, and we all see top pros sprint off the tee pad and go really fast, and you think, for me to get more distance, I need to run super fast off the tee, but that's not really the case. You want to make sure that your steps are not necessarily robotic, but they need to be nice and fluid. They don't need to be too fast. The same thing goes for reach back. But reach back actually has a little bit more of a pause to it. There's a video online, really good video, that has, I think, me, Paul Macbeth, Dave Felberg, and Jeremy Colling from the European Championship super slow-mo. And I always suggest people go back to that video, or go to any slow motion video, and time out the first 2 steps or 3 steps in relation to how long it is for them reaching back. Because the reach back is always longer. One motion is longer than the first 2 steps. Because what happens is when you get to this step, this foot goes forward, but it takes a second to set the hips and the front foot and to get in the right position to explode and then start pulling forward. So same thing goes for sidearm. You want to make sure that you're not running up and going, straight forward. You're not going to pick up any distance by having a faster reach back. You're going to have to pick up more distance by having a faster or stronger pull through, or more power off of your legs, your hips, or anything like that. So same thing going to reach back. You want to make sure that you're coming through nice, smooth, or slow reach back, and then really fast acceleration.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Set your feet on a flick drive. Are you going to get to that, or?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so the next thing, we'll do the same thing with sidearm as we did backhand. We'll kind of talk from the ground up. So, how many people here do not throw sidearm at all? One person. No, I'm just kidding. So a couple people, so it's really good. There's usually a couple people, some people throw some sidearm in the clinics, but for sidearm, I always suggest to open up the front foot. I don't turn my foot. I don't see a whole lot of pros that do turn their feet. I relate it to a shortstop throwing to first base in baseball, where they're picking up the disc and then moving their feet on one more time on one line, and then accelerating, pushing off, and throwing to first base. So when I see that, I see a lot of baseball players, whatever it is, opening up the front foot and really focusing on this back foot and accelerating and pushing off. So that's where the distance is kind of coming from, is pushing off on this back foot and accelerating through. Same thing with accuracy. I try to make sure that my feet are lined up, and so that goes into my run up if I'm throwing a dead straight sidearm, or typically more of a left to right sidearm. I'm coming at a right to left angle across the tee pad, and then I'm following through on that line like we were talking about. Same thing for backhand.
So you don't do a cross step as much as just bring your feet together?
Yeah, I try to just bring my feet together. And I tried, and to be completely honest, 2012, I threw about 5% sidearm. On hole 2 or long, I would throw 5% sidearm off the tee pad. One of the more important shots is when you're in the bushes and you can throw the putter or mid-range, up and high. But besides that, off the tee pad, I probably threw 5 or 10%. And I would do the whole, wind your disc up type thing. Avery Jenkins used to do it a lot back then. And then you would take the last step and turn your whole upper body. And so I never really felt fully comfortable with that, because I felt like with that last step, you're moving from here all the way back in one spot with one step. So once I changed up my run up to where I was staying on that one line and lining up my shoulders towards the target and basically looking where I'm going and then coming through here, I felt a lot more comfortable. It could be because I played baseball my whole life. I don't know what it was, but I never felt comfortable, lining up and taking that last step and then coming through that one. But with lining up one more time, I'm looking for my shoulders and my feet, basically lining up with my left hand, like you're about to throw left-handed, very close to it. But opening up this front foot almost like it's 45 degrees on the tee pad, not necessarily straight at the tee, but a little bit turned. And then with reach back, same thing with backhand, is you want to avoid having the disc too high, because what happens is, of course, you're going to pull down, and it's really easy to have that swooping motion, and then you're going to get a lot of disc underneath a lot of wind underneath the rim, and then it's going to kind of shoot left and take away a lot of your speed. So with your reach back, you're almost closer to your knee or your hip, and then you're accelerating on one straight line. So in sidearm, a lot of people have always said keeping your elbow tight. They haven't said how to keep your elbow tight, but you want to make sure that you're not leaving it in one spot and going like this by any means. You don't want to do that. You want to kind of lead with your elbow, almost stay as tight as you can to your body, and then you want to make sure you are not straightening your arm. I see a lot of people who straighten their arm back and then they lead with their elbow in and then they straighten it at the very end. I believe that if you can keep your elbow and kind of your bicep at the same angle, so if you reach back, almost at like a 65, I guess 70-degree angle, and then you pull through it, your wrist works like a pendulum, if that makes sense, because when I reach back, I have that loaded wrist like we were talking about, and the more that I pull through, my wrist is going to open up until the very end. And so my arm isn't necessarily going to be extended all the way out. It's not going to be extended all the way back. It stays on that my elbow stays on that one straight line, and then I open up right when I throw. Does that make sense? So I'll throw a couple of examples. So I'll throw a nice, easy ball run up here. Anybody have any questions?
What stability are you really throwing now?
Say that again.
You mostly throw all pretty overstable stuff.
For over sidearm? For over sidearm? Yeah. I try to actually keep it fairly straight because I feel like my shoulder likes it a lot more whenever I'm not coming this way over the top. And so for overstable type stuff, I'll use it for around 300 feet. But my confident type of shot is something that's like a fairway driver, kind of those two was an H3 and an F2, so they weren't drivers. So they're a lot easier to throw straight on a slide hyzer. For a driver, I'm throwing something that would be flippy for my backhand because I can release on a slight hyzer coming here, and then I can get it to kind of slow flip up and then still fade at the very end. But for me, I've never been very accurate coming across this way.
I didn't mean so much as turnover, but for disc selection, because I know like Sexton's always throwing Firebirds and throwing the most overstable
stuff. Sure, yeah.
You didn't look like you threw something super overstable.
No, yeah, and I'm not and for me personally, I like it a lot straighter. So like a good way to really, and it could be because I learned to throw sidearm throwing more understable discs. And when I started to throw a lot more sidearm a few years ago, I learned to throw sidearm with like my putters and mid-ranges and stuff like that instead of throwing like overstable discs, because I wanted to learn how to put the spin on the disc and have a nice, smooth, consistent form, because I was tired of just shanking it all over the place. So I would go out to the field with actually these exact discs, so like an M4, and then my putting putters, everybody kind of jokes around and throws the disc to the next tee pad. And for the people that don't really throw sidearm, a really good way to learn to throw sidearm is to just toss it 80 feet, 100 feet, and get used to the feeling of the disc flying out of your hand. Because I think that's one thing that really messes up a lot of people, is they relate their backhand and they're throwing their backhand really hard and really far, and then they think, okay, sidearm, I'm going to try to throw my sidearm the same speed. And that was my problem. Was as a kid, like 16, I could throw it 500 feet. I'm thinking, okay, sidearm, I can do the same thing. I'm going to try to rip it, but it's completely different muscle, everything. It's almost like completely different brain sometimes, I think. So to really learn to throw sidearm, you got to start from step one, as you did on the backhand. So really understable, straight discs, mid-ranges, putters, and really go out and throw it 80 to 100 feet and learn the correct form. Same thing that goes with backhand. This off season, I hurt my shoulder. I had a shoulder impingement. I didn't have any surgery or anything like that, but my recovery and the routine that I did getting back into throwing was related to a pitcher in the MLB coming back from Tommy John surgery. And what he would do is, or a pitching workout was to throw 50 shots at 10% power for a whole month. So I would go out to a field, really loud semi-truck comes by, but I would go out to a field and I would line up every single day. I would go to the gym, go to the field, throw 50 shots exactly like this. And I would not throw any more than 50 or 60 feet for a month, because when you go out and you start to rip shots really hard, is you're creating really bad habits. And so since I hurt my shoulder, I didn't want to create any more bad habits, and I wanted just being back to really good backhand form. So that's the last thing that you want to do, of course, in the first place. So I also believe that if you guys are really working on your backhand form, or if you feel like you're hurting yourself because you're trying to throw too hard, or sidearm, if you're really trying to get your sidearm to a point you feel confident, go out to a field and don't be ashamed if you're going like this. It's okay, because your fingers have to get used to the release or the spin off of your hand. It's okay not to throw as hard as you can or go super far. I personally feel like if I go out to a field and I practice throwing just with perfect form, throwing 100 feet, and I do that once a day before a really big tournament, I feel on point whenever I get to the tournament. So I always go out to a field, grab a practice bag full of discs, or throw your bag 2 or 3 times, and really try to just have perfect form to where you're not going back and stopping. You're looking at the target, coming through, and then nice and easy like that. So I think that's a really good practice routine, especially for sidearm, because when you get to throwing sidearm, a lot of people getting to the whipping motion, and that's the last thing that you want to do, because you'll really hurt your shoulder. And kind of like back to your question after I got into this long tangent of stories and stuff like that, but when you're loading up that reach back, you want to make sure that the disc is actually behind your elbow whenever you start to accelerate.
Okay.
The reason is because I see a lot of people out there who rip the disc back and their elbow forward, and that wrecks the rotator cuff, and you're going to really hurt your shoulder or elbow pretty quick. So when you're loading up that sidearm, I personally really make a point to load the disc back, and it's almost 2 steps of keeping the disc behind you here and then accelerating through. I see a lot of players who get to that last step and get to here, and then they're like whip back and forward at the same time. I always think that slow reach back and then accelerate through is going to be the best way to do it. Did you say you do that?
No,
Yeah.
I just said I could
Okay.
feel it.
You honestly, and I hate even showing like how to do it, because you can really feel it. Like once you start to whip the disc back and your elbow forward, I mean it'll wreck your arm pretty quick. And so you never think, slower reach back, accelerate faster and get more distance. Everybody thinks fast, got to move really hard and throw it really hard and, throw over stable disc, but you really want to have a nice slow reach back and then accelerate through. Yeah. Awesome. But a good way, like if everybody holds the disc out in front of you and you see, your elbow, you want to make sure that disc is on the other side of your elbow here. So when you go to reach back, it's not having any pressure on the front and whipping forward by any means. You're almost holding it behind your arm and then accelerating through. Does that make sense? Scans, you got a question? Okay, cool.
I have a question. It doesn't pertain to flicking though.
Yeah.
What do you do for putting practice? So
that's really good. Putting practice, you want to make sure you have the same putters. Right? I think the first thing is to have the same putters. Have 4 or 5. And the same thing, like I was talking about with driving, I would go do 50 drives. I would come home, I would do 50 putts that were really close to the basket. Okay. I think I was number one ranked in the world 4 years ago. The best I was only practicing putting inside 30 feet. I wasn't putting from 60 feet or 50 feet or anything like that. I was really focusing on basically just lining up and having a consistent release. And a consistent release meaning that, if you're lining up to the basket, and it's kind of subjective because there's so many putting forms that are effective out there. And so putting practice and routine is number one out of everything, no matter whatever your putt looks like. But routine and consistency is what's going to win the putting game.
Okay.
So lining up for your putt, or what I would do like for practice, is really making sure you're not focusing on how the disc is going or anything like that, but making sure that you can actually, for me, it's how the feeling is off my fingertips. That's what I would pay attention to. I wouldn't pay attention to really anything else, but as soon as I could have that touch off my hand, and I was actually looking straight down my shoulder, going towards the basket, that's when I was the most effective.
Okay.
So you could go putt in the dark, just like in basketball. I talk about dribbling in the dark. Going to putt in the dark and really just get used to the touch of the putter coming out of your hand, and then you can feel your shoulder come straight up in one straight line. Same thing goes for like push putt or anything like that, or spin putt, because you can come down this way and you can still come across and reach out towards the basket there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And would you pick it from the same position, or would you change your position with each putt?
I would change the position.
Okay.
Just slightly. I mean, I would still stay within 30 feet, but I would go 30 feet, like,
or like
if you can.
To the side or
yeah,
something.
yeah, like step to the side, or I would go straddle putt, and I would do straddle putt and lean over on one leg, and I'll go straddle putt and lean over on the other leg, and I would go, straight. Or mix it up just a little tiny bit, not a ton, because you're really focusing on being consistent.
Okay.
And over and over and over again, because those 25 and 30 footers do relate to 40 and 45 feet. You're just looking a little bit more power, but you have to have the consistent release. I see a lot of players practicing from farther distance, and they're trying something crazy, like trying to turn it over to get to the basket from 40 feet, and there's no reason to practice that kind of stuff because you're looking to get as close as you can to the basket from the tee. You want to have that consistent release over and over and over again. Because another 10 more feet on your putt isn't very long. So a little bit more power or a little bit more speed on it, and you can stand still and putt for 40 feet.
Okay, awesome.
I got 2 driving questions.
Yeah.
And the first one is, you didn't touch on it, I didn't know if you were going to get to it, but one thing I think varies in my game, which I don't think is good, is what's my posture on the follow through?
Okay.
Flick and backhand.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good question.
Sometimes the leaning back, did I do that poorly because I didn't finish with my weight on my back foot?
Yeah.
And then I hope for us New Englanders, talk to us about playing in snow
Yeah.
when we don't get to run up.
All right.
What can we do to change our
Yeah.
drives and maintain as much distance?
That's a
without
good time to practice that standstill, like I was talking
Right.
about. A really good time to practice that, especially because you can't run up. But your first question with posture on follow through, I think that's really important because a lot of people think it's follow through is like the disc is already out of my hand, it's gone, my job is over. But really, follow through could be one of the more important parts because without it, any shot is not really going to work out. Because there's a common problem of people throwing a straight shot and kind of dropping their arm and watching their disc as soon as they can. But in my opinion, the best follow through, a really good example to watch is Kale LaVisca because he over exaggerates follow through every single time he throws a disc. But with his follow through, if he's coming through throwing a shot, he's almost always left shoulder wherever he just threw. And that's kind of the standard in almost every single shot above maybe 50%. And you can think everything like percentage-wise going down, like for a short shot, you're not really going to have a big follow-through. But I would always suggest at least bring the left hand through and get used to that kind of stuff. But for a really hard shot, like off of hole 1, you're looking to come through and you're almost all the way over. You know, you're almost bringing all of your momentum across your body that way. That makes sense.
Let me do it again so I can watch how if your front foot spins.
I'll throw a shot for you.
Because you
front foot, is that what you're looking for?
And then it's so if you're finishing, are you actually doing a little pirouette on the ball
Yes,
of your foot?
so that's actually another question inside of the question.
Sorry, did I go
That's
over
okay.
my limit?
No, it's
I'm
okay.
sorry,
No,
guys,
it's
don't
good.
hate me. Don't
It's
hate
good.
me.
That's actually a great
I'm
question.
making you late for recess.
That's a great question because you're kind of talking about like last step toe to heel. And so we were talking about that drill where you wanted to have your toe here. That actually makes it possible for you to move from toe to heel whenever you open up. If you have all of that weight on your front foot, like we were talking about, you don't want to do, it's almost impossible to go from your toe to your heel and rotate because you have all of your body on one foot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you're all standing on one foot, you're not really going to go from your toe to your heel and feel like you're balanced by any means. So if your back and your upper body weight is more on this back leg, front foot's coming through as that balance, you're pulling through and accelerating, hips go first, and then that toe is actually going to open up almost after you release. And that's how the hips open up and go into the shot. Does that make sense?
Yep. So you're right up until the release and the follow through, you're actually pushing against your heel. You're pushing against it to gain the force, and then when you
This way. So I'll throw a really like smooth shot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my toe here, and then when I'm pulling through, it's going to go this way and open up. So it goes from toe to heel, and then that's how you get the rotation and open up on your front foot. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So it's going to move kind of fast, so I'll throw a couple shots.
So you still end up with your weight balanced between your 2 feet. You're
Yeah.
not ending up with your weight on top of your front foot.
Yes, right. It's almost, I don't want to say almost never, but it's very rare that you're going to see somebody with their whole weight on their front foot here. Like it's almost very not going to happen. Same thing with a baseball player. When they're going to go hit, you don't see them here. You know, this is when they're swinging and they're just chopping at air, and that's when that happens. So when they're coming through, like with the disc, they're coming through this way, and their upper body is almost centered, maybe a little bit back centered when their disc is halfway through. And that's when you're pushing off of this back leg and pulling through, hips are first, and then your front foot opens towards the target.
So where does your back foot end up when you do it? Let me see it again.
So the thing with the back foot too is really important is you have to make sure your hips are shifting, and shifting is moving from left to right. A lot of people think your back foot, they don't really think about it, but you have a lot of weight back here. You should have a lot of weight back here. So you don't want to just be picking it up off the ground and bringing it forward. It's actually a little bit of a movement where when you come through, your hips are coming in this way. So your toe, and I've ruined so many shoes doing it, but it's the way that you kind of want to throw, is to really bring in this back foot whenever you're about to throw, because that's shifting the weight off the back foot coming through and then the rotation. That make sense? Yeah. So I'll throw another. That make sense?
Yep. Because like I think I was having a problem of ending up with too much weight and leaning forward or back, but what I realize you're doing is your weight is centered, so you're not forward or back, you're just over it.
Yeah. Right. You guys got any more questions? Yeah.
So I'm a toe dragger. Are there any
On your back foot?
Both.
Okay.
Forehand, it's one foot, backhand's the other. Are there any drills I can do to work on getting that up, or is that just something I need to be more conscious of when I do my form drills?
I can't tell you because I ruin my shoes all the time.
Okay, well, never mind then.
But I personally feel like that's the way you should throw, because the last thing that you want to do is take that step and then pick your back foot up and move around. Because if you think about it, all that weight is here, and if to shift it, to bring it through, it's got to actually move forward like that. And so that's where you're going to get that toe drag. And it's going to be toe drag and then rotate. But if you pick it up off the ground, you're not going to really be shifting your hips at all. You know, and it's kind of hard to be shifting it and then come up off the ground too, you know, because then you're a little unbalanced. Same thing goes for sidearm whenever you're coming through, is it happens just a little tiny bit. But if we had turf tee pads or something like that, your shoes would be fine. Yeah. But that's just one of the things that is you know, they say you can see a lot from a person from the bottom of their shoes, like what's happening. And so as long as you're dragging your toe, it's better than picking it up and then rotating instead of shifting. That's kind of the two things there. Just play a lot more. Yeah.
All right. I don't know if this is necessarily related, but I haven't heard like a technical explanation of it. I've seen you and a couple other guys throw like these turnover shots that go up over something, but as they turn, you control the nose so it dips down and it'll come down over it.
Yeah.
How do you approach a shot like that? Do you change like your grip or your swing in order to manipulate it to
So it's
come?
a little bit of disc stability, also the stability of the disc, and usually it's a putter or a really understable fairway, maybe mid-range, because what happens is, you know, is it's the one thing you don't want to do with that type of shot is to throw up and then to get the front of the disc straight up, because the front of the disc is never going to move like this and then come down. Like, it just won't happen. But if you can get more of like the very edge of the corner, like a nose down angle and really high, especially if it's an understable disc, it's got to stay down. It's going to turn, and then just like an Anheuser shot, if you can get the front of the disc slightly over, like barely bent, and usually it's on the front right side, if you can get the nose over. And that's what happens like massive distance shots when people throw them. They're coming down, and then you look at it like this, and then it looks like it flexes out like that. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so that's what happens is they get almost the front right side over a little tiny bit, and then it holds, and the wind is now on top of the disc, and then it's going to slow down and go there, and then come down. That's a really hard shot, though, to pull off.
Yeah.
Yeah, really hard shot.
That's why I saved that question.
Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions? All right. Well, I'd love to get a group picture with everybody if we can. We have like professional iPhone photo scans over here. So if you guys can, let's stand back here.
You want to get in on it?